Yo. So, you want to never get hacked? Well, there's not really a magical way of doing that. You have to understand how hacking works and how hacking happens, and go from there. Follow on with the video, and you probably never get hacked. So, how does hacking actually work? It works on three different layers, right? So, the very first layer is the big brain layer. It's the cryptography. All right, we call it crypto layer. Now, this is where all the big brain peoples are because this is the most secure layer of hacking. People who target this generally can get it to work. There's only one guy who poses a legitimate threat to the crypto layer of cybersecurity, and that guy is named Peter Shor. Okay, he's a very popular person. If you want to know what he did, you're more than welcome to look into it, but I'm not going to elaborate. Well, I will elaborate, but just not right now. So the second layer of cybersecurity, or rather hacking, is the sexist layer, right? It's the sexist layer. This is the security system layer. Now, this targets companies and corporations, corpos, right? You don't really have to worry about these two, but you unfortunately have to engage in business with companies and corporations. So all I can do here is to give you some examples of security systems that involves companies and corporations and tell you what kind of a behavior is recommended so that you can protect yourself from the potential fallout of their fuck ups. And as we know, they kind of fucks up a lot, okay? So this is a good example of where they fuck up and how they fuck up. And another example, another method of of their fuck up, password reset bypass. It's a very common one. It happened to so many companies that I can't even it's mind-boggling how this simple exploit, how this simple vulnerabilities has damaged so many different companies. That includes some of the famous gaming company too, like Epic Games, Steam. Oh, not Steam, but Valve. They all suffer from this. Now, the last layer of cybersecurity is the user layer. So this is where you come in. I don't want to elaborate too much into it. I'm gonna give you a tip on how to approach this, but usually you want to use your common sense. Okay? That is a completely wrong way of spelling sense. Right? So on this layer, use your brain. Don't click on dodgy emails and installing malwares and just plug in random thumb drive into your holes. Don't do that, okay? Okay, so let's talk about crypto. So for cryptography, it's mostly based on number theory. You don't need to know any of that, and it wouldn't have mattered. So what you do need to know is that Fermat is a guy, and he is packing very little. So, well, actually, you don't need to know that either. But what you do need to know is there are two encryption standards. First one called AES, which stands for Advanced Encryption Standards. The second one is called RSA. Now, this stands for the acronym of their inventor, Rivest, Shamir, and Adelman. Okay, so AES is a symmetric key encryption. Okay, now what does that mean? That means you have one key to encrypt and decrypt the entire thing. You have one key to encrypt the message into a cipher, and you have a same key to decrypt the cipher back into the plaintext. Okay, so that key will be shared privately. Given that the sharing process is secure, this is perfectly secure. Okay, there is no major vulnerabilities of AES whatsoever. Okay, this is perfectly secure. And this is generally used for data encryption. For example, if you have a database somewhere that you render the server on, and if you choose to encrypt that, most likely they will be encrypted using AES. Um, Other example will be classified documents. You can also, most classified documents for the governments especially are encrypted using AES 256. So this is for data encryption and is perfectly secure. You don't have to worry anything about it. And as a matter of fact, AES is so secure, it is inherently, uh-oh, is inherently quantum proof. Okay? Okay, I'm not speaking magic here. AES is inherently quantum proof. Okay? So take this for granted. Don't worry about anything. So when you have a database or you have some documents that you want to, encrypt, that you want to keep safe, use AES and make sure you share your keys responsibly, and you'll be fine. Now, most of the encryptions done on the internet are not AES because the key sharing can be a pain in the ass. So what do? We need a public key system. That's where RSA comes in. Okay? RSA is the successor of something called Diffie-Hellman. Okay? Now, Diffie-Hellman is the first popular public key algorithm. Okay? Public key encryption and public key sharing, that's Diffie-Hellman. RSA improved upon that and is mostly secure. Okay? I'll say mostly secure. Mostly secure. And why do I say mostly secure? Well, it is vulnerable to certain things, right? It's vulnerable to a lot of attacks that can be resolved by choosing a large key. So you have to pack big for this one. Choosing a large key, and that's okay. Actually, it's keys because this goes for encryption and decryption. Use two different keys for that. Knowing that, why is Peter Shore so dangerous? Well, there is a realistic threat of attack to the RSA called factorization. Now, how does factorization come into this, right? So I'll give you a brief explanation of how RSA actually work. All right. So the RSA. What is the RSA and why is it vulnerable to factorization? Okay. It is very important to know this. Okay. It is very important to know why factorization is a big problem for RSA and why Shore's algorithm can potentially end the world. RSA has four essential components: the E, the D, the Q, and the P. Okay. So Q and P are very large prime numbers. Okay. If you don't know what a prime number is, they are the introvert of natural numbers. Okay. They are the socially awkward people. They are all alone. Nobody likes them. Nobody likes to associate with them. And they are pretty miserable. Okay. So that's what prime numbers are. Okay. So N is defined as Q, well, that's P multiplied by Q. Okay. So before we go on any further, I have to just tell you that there is something called a torsion function. A torsion functions are very toy, so you have to understand it for this to make sense. So what torsion function is, specifically in this case, is the Carmichael version of the torsion function, is denoted as lambda n equals to the least common multiple of p minus 1 and q minus 1. Okay? The brackets all over the place, but you know what I mean, right? So that is a torsion function. Okay? So now we get to choose E. How do we choose E? We choose a very large E. There is a convention of that, and if I write out the number, you'll know what it is. This 65337. Okay? E is usually that number, which E is the public key, so it doesn't really matter that everybody knows that number. How is E usually chosen? E is chosen to be the co-prime of the tuition function. Coprime meaning their greatest common denominator between the key e, see, between the key e and the tuition function is 1. So they have only 1 as their common denominator. They're very different people. They're like Muslims and Christians. Okay? So once you have e, the decryption key is defined as the multiplicative inverse of your encryption key modular your tuition function. Okay? So that's how you obtain all 4 of those components. Let me wipe the board again. So with all that established, how does the encryption and decryption actually work, right? So let's say you have a message. How do you get the message to a cipher? Well, the cipher is obtained by raising the message to the power of your encryption key modular n. Okay? And you decrypt the cipher in a very similar manner. You get the plain text back by raising the cipher to the power of your decryption key, which is a private key, modular n. Okay? So that's how it works. There are only 2 components that's transmitted publicly, and obviously the private key is held on to privately. Okay, so the 2 components transmitted publicly to everybody is the encryption key and the value n, which is the product of p and q. Okay, you can actually formulate the entirety of RSA in elliptic curve, but that's it's really just irrelevant. It's just the equivalencies. Okay, so with that established, why is factorization a problem? I'm going to stop saying tuition function now because I feel like, the joke has run its course. So it is not possible to know the value of the tuition function of n just by knowing the value n, right? Remember the formulation of the tuition function of n, which is the Carmichael version, which is the least common multiple of e minus 1 and q minus 1. Okay? So it's not possible to know this tuition function value with just n, but if you can factor n, which is the product of 2 big prime, then you can know the tuition function's value when you can know what the p is and what the q is. Well, once you know the tuition function value, you also know the private key, which is the multiplicative inverse of the encryption key, which is public, remember, and modular the tuition function's value. Okay? So this is why factorization is very dangerous, right? If you can factor out n as the product of the 2 large prime, then you can acquire the value of the tuition function, then you can acquire the decryption key, and then you can just eavesdrop on anything that they are talking about. So that includes like bank information, passwords, all the kind of juicy stuff. Shor's algorithm is a quantum algorithm for factorization. Okay, it's from Peter Shor, and it is very difficult to compare time complexities of quantum algorithms and classical algorithms, but just understand that Shor's algorithm factors a product of 2 large prime in a very reasonable amount of time that it poses a legitimate threat to RSA. Okay, it has a little knife to the RSA's throat. Okay, now this problem becomes even worse when you realize about like 99% of the internet traffic is encrypted using RSA. The things that you hear about using, the TCP protocols and the transport layer securities, these all uses RSA for encryption. Okay, but the thing is, and I have to just reassure you of this, you have to trust me on this, is that the advancements in cryptography is always outpacing its vulnerabilities. Okay, so trust me on this, and I'll give you an example of why, right? Shor's algorithm is an algorithm that came up in the 1990s. Okay, it has existed for a very long time, but back then, quantum computing isn't realistic yet. Well, recently, IBM has done a lot of work in quantum computing, and quantum computers gotten really, really good, right? And in response to that, NIST has held a competition for 6 years looking for quantum resistant cryptographies. And in 2022, they announced 4 winners of quantum resistant cryptography. So we're already well ahead of the curve to have a replacement in mind of something that's quantum resistant and it has a public key structure. So don't worry about any of this. If you understand what I'm saying here and understood everything that I've been saying, you should rest assured that cryptography is the last thing that you need to worry about when it comes to cybersecurity. The advancements in cryptography always outpaces its vulnerabilities, okay? Especially in peaceful times. Okay, so with cryptography out of the way, we move on to security system. Now, what I like to call sexist, right? Sexist, right? Is a security system layer of hacking. So in this layer, it is very complicated. Things starts to get like really, really, really haywire. And security system, the specifics of it depends on the domain that you're talking about and the product, right? Different product have different security vulnerabilities. Like hardware have their own unique set of vulnerabilities and software have their own unique vulnerabilities. So I cannot talk about this specifically. I could get in trouble for talking about some of them. So I'm going to not engage in this conversation, and there really isn't much to talk about to begin with because there are limitless amount of products out there and each of them have their own security vulnerabilities and their own security system designs. Some of them are better than others, and this video will go on literally forever if I talk about system security for the products. So what can we talk about here? Well, the only thing that we can really talk about is the interface that we engage with those company services and products, right? And this interface for us as customers are twofold: authentication and payment. Okay? Right. So there are security systems in place for specifically authentication, less so in payment. I think like the payment methods and payment standards on the internet is quite loose and quite dangerous. But we do have security systems for the interface that we engage this company with. Security systems for specifically authentication. All right. So, what is a popular security system for authentication? You probably all have already heard of this. It's called the two-factor authentication, right? Now, two-factor authentication is theoretically very secure, right? Very secure. Is theoretically incredibly secure, but it gives people a false sense of security in that it is practically very insecure. Okay. There are so many ways to break a ill-designed two-factor authentication. Do not trust a authentication system with two-factor authentication blindly. Think about what they're doing, look at potential ways that they can fuck you up, and make a judgment on top of that. Okay? So, how can you break a two-factor authentication? Well, there are two main ways I'm going to talk about in this video. Both are very common. The first one is the one that I mentioned at the beginning of the video called password reset bypass. Okay? Set bypass. And the second one is duplicate keygen. Okay? Let me wipe the board real quick. All right, so first thing, password reset, bypass. Reset, bypass. Now, how does this work? Fortunately, this is no longer a prevalent issue, but it used to be the case for a lot of websites that they will ask you for two-factor authentication when you log in, right? But they will not ask you two-factor authentications when you do password reset. Okay? Now, we all know password is very insecure, right? Like people targeting the user layers of cybersecurity or user layer of hacking can get your password through a variety of ways. It is very, very, very easy to get somebody's password if they're not careful. Now, with password reset bypass, that exploits a ill-designed two-factor authentication system, right? And how does that work? Well, some websites in the past, they do not require you to use two-factor authentication when you request a password reset. All they did was you enter your old password, you enter your new password, done. Okay? I cannot show you examples of how they still work in this way. There are organizations out there that still have the system. I'm not gonna name names. They still do this. You enter old password, new password, and all of a sudden you have a new password. It's absolutely insane that this is still the case. It's nuts. But this is how password reset bypass works. It's very simple exploit. It doesn't have to be password reset. Any type of account information change that does not require two-factor authentication bypasses the two-factor authentication, right? This vulnerability very common, and unfortunately, most big websites have realized this and have already patched this. So this is the first one that we talked about of authentication vulnerabilities. Okay. Now the second one is duplicate keygen. This one might not be as commonly talked about, and this involves ill-designed authenticators. Okay, ill-designed authenticators. So usually your two-factor authentication system, your authenticator works on something called a pseudo random generator. Okay. Now this pseudo random generator works on two components. First one is a seed value. Now the seed value, you probably have already heard of it. If you know what RNG is, you probably know what seed is. And this is chosen randomly. So randomly chosen. And the second component of a pseudo random generator is a generation algorithm. Okay. So this could be potentially very dangerous, especially when it comes to two-factor authentication codes that come through text messages and emails. So there are some companies, they have their own pseudo-random generators for the keys for their two-factor authentication system. Some of those companies can present a security vulnerability by leaking the generation algorithm and a bunch of random seeds for a bunch of customers. Okay. Once you have those two components, anybody can regenerate your two-factor authentication code. Okay. They can duplicate your two-factor authentication code with those two components. Right. This is also a very common vulnerability that doesn't really go away. You have to just rely on the companies and the services that you use and the authenticator that you use that they do this part properly and not leak the generation algorithm and shuffles your seed in a reasonable period of time. Okay. Now that you know how those attacks happen, And what can we actually do about it, right? Like, if a company fucks up, it's not like we can fix the problem for them. All we can do is reduce our own risk, right? It's all about reducing our own risk in a potential fallout. Okay. So, how do we do this? How do we reduce our risk? I'm going to have a 3 recommendations that you do. Hopefully, that you do. Okay, I'm going to recommend you 3 different things. First of all, it's very obvious. Keep your authentication method up to date. Okay? That involves changing your password regularly, updating your authenticators and all that kind of stuff. Okay? Keep your authentication methods up to date. Now, the second one is, in my opinion, far more effective and far more important, is limit exposure. Okay? So there are 2 aspects of limiting exposure. First one is obviously on the authentication side, and the other one is, usually this is written as auth, but it stands for authentication. Okay, the second part is going to be about payment. Now, like I have said, I think this part on the internet and the way that people are practicing this is incredibly dangerous. And I want to give you some ideas and raise some awareness and just be careful with this, right? Okay, because you do have to do online transactions, and this part is kind of unavoidable. So hopefully I'll give you some useful tips on how to reduce your risk in terms of payments and leaking your payment information to potential bad actors. Okay, so let's talk about limiting exposures and how we can do that. Okay, so limit exposure. All right. What do I mean by limit exposure? You want to limit your exposure to the services and the companies. Okay? You don't give them information that are related to your identity. Okay? Don't ever do that. Okay? And how are you able to achieve this? Well, if the company is only asking you to register with an email, register only with an email and use the throwaway email. Okay? When it's a unimportant service, for example, like your bank information, your mortgage, and all that kind of stuff, if that's not the case, use a throwaway email. Okay? Make a new email, either that be Proton, or as a matter of fact, Gmail works perfectly fine, right? Just make a new Gmail account with fake names and custom email address, and don't link your phone number to this, and use that email instead. Okay? 2, as I said, if it's only asking you for email, only register with email. Never give away your phone number. Okay? This is incredibly important because you can't just spam out phone numbers. So never give away your actual phone numbers. Now, obviously, there are services that's unavoidable. They require you to give you their phone numbers. In my opinion, unless they're essential services, that is incredibly scummy. They should never ask for your real phone number unless you're essential services that require ID check. Okay? So, phone numbers. Okay? Just in case that you have to have a phone number. For example, Blizzard Entertainment. It's the dumbest fucking idea, and I think it's super invasive to their customers' privacy. So, even if you do have to do it, how would you do it? Right? Use proxy numbers. If you're serious about your security, look into proxy phone numbers. Right? Something like Twilio Look into those and use a proxy phone number. Okay. The last thing that I'm going to talk about with limited exposure is never give away identifiable additional information. Okay. That includes birthday or age, gender. Do not give them any of this. You do not have the legal obligation to do it truthfully. Okay? They do not have the legal right to force you to give them accurate information in this regard. Okay? So, never give identifiable info. Always use the proxy phone number if it is required. Use a throwaway email for unessential services, right? Use a main email for banks and stuff, for like really important stuff. But other than that, I wouldn't use the main email for anything, because you're just opening yourself up to spams and shit, and I don't think that's a good idea. Okay, so that's about limiting exposure. This protects you from potential authentication break. Okay. So if a company gets hacked, practicing this will protect you from the damage, will reduce your risk very significantly when it comes to authentication breaks, right? If someone breaks the authentication of the company and they access all this information, or someone break your authentication and access all those information, all of those informations are irrelevant. Okay. They are meaningless, they are replaceable, they're expendable. This reduces exposure and reduces risks when it comes to authentication. Okay. So payment. All right. Let's talk about payment for a bit. This, in my opinion, is the worst handled security on the entire internet. Okay. There's very little awareness on how you process and how you should handle payment on the internet. And it is also the most important thing that you can do on the internet is paying through internet. So I want to talk about how you can protect yourself from any vulnerabilities that on a sexist level, and protect your credit card and your banking information from the fallout of those security breaches. All right, first thing first, never use debit card online. Okay? Never do that. And the same thing with a checking account. Okay? Do not ever do this. This is a big no-no. Now, if you have to use this, for example, you have to pay your bills online, you have to pay your mortgage and whatever. Okay? Use it once. Never save this information online. This is the most dangerous payment method that there is, because anybody with your account number and routing numbers can just withdraw money from your account. Okay? Most companies that offers debit card or checking account information handle this very securely, and they're a registered vendor with the banks, right? But it is still possible for people to get all the money out of you just by hacking your saved checking account or debit card information online. Never use debit card or checking account to pay for things on the internet. Or if you do have to use them, never save these payment methods. Never do. Okay? So the second thing is avoid using credit card. Okay? Avoid using credit card. Why do I say this? Your credit card doesn't get updated that often, right? The process of replacing a credit card is very, very annoying, and you have to deactivate your credit card, and the charge dispute sometimes can be really tricky. So avoid using credit card, and there's additional security risk that involves credit card, and that is specifically from the companies that tells you to use credit card. So nowadays, it seems like there's a trend for companies to tell you to use credit cards, and they offer a feature called one-click payment. Okay? This is a humongous red flag. Okay? If you're using credit card and they offer you one-click payment, do not ever engage in this. Do not trust them. They are offered this as a convenience to get you to spend more money. Okay? If they offer one-click payment with credit card, that negates the necessity of you needing to enter the CVV number. Uh-uh. Uh-uh. Don't trust them and never use a credit card with some services or website that offers one-click payment. Don't do it, man. Just don't do it. Well, now you might wonder, what should we use then? Like, I mean, we can't use credit card, we can't use debit card. What should we use? Here is a personal recommendation that I think has always worked well for me is use trusted third party. Okay? Now, personally, I would recommend using something like PayPal, right? PayPal is very well established. They are very trustworthy and they work very well. The reason you should use a trusted third party is it often offers a double authentication process, right? So imagine if your account got compromised, using PayPal as a payment information will require the attackers and the bad actors to authenticate additionally through PayPal, which should be a lot more secure than just using credit card and debit card. So it offers a double layer of authentication when it comes to payment. And in my opinion, this is the best way to go about it. And even then, I will tell you that if you care about your security and you want to use PayPal, do not save payment information. And this relates back to this. Some cheeky businesses, in order to streamline the way you can spend money with them, they offer one-click payment even for PayPal. Okay? They offer one-click payment even for PayPal accounts. So do not ever save your payment information if one-click payment is a thing on a platform or website. Okay? Okay. So we're on to the last part, the last layer, the user layer. Okay. Now, when it comes to the user layer, you should just use your brain and you should be fine. I'll see y'all later. Okay. No, I'm just kidding. All right. This is actually probably the most important layer. And this is also the part where you can do the most and you can get hurt the most. And because of how like diverse the user habits are, and just how many different software and hardwares that different users interact with, it is pretty much impossible for me to cover all different kind of attack vectors and vulnerabilities. So I'll just mention some abstract principles that will almost always guarantee your safety. Okay. And before I get into the detail of how this kind of attack works, I want to point out something that's quite obvious. Okay. So the obvious security measure that you should all be aware of is keep your system up to date. Okay. Keep your system up to date. Okay. And by the systems, I mean your default antivirus. Most of the time, your default antivirus is more than good enough, right? And one specific mention I want to emphasize on is your router. Okay, I assume you all have one. And this one, I want you all to pay special attention to. Okay, router security travels the dark border between crypto and sexist. Okay, people who work on router securities, they are really tough. They are really tough people. Okay, so router dangles between here. That's where router security belongs to. And if you haven't gotten the impression from the explanation and understanding of cryptography, if something goes wrong here, there isn't really much you can do. The only thing you can do is just to hope for the best. That somewhat applies here, okay? So if your router fails, you might as well just pray for the best, okay? So keep your router's firmware up to date. It's very important. Check it every 3 months. And subscribe to your router provider's newsletters or updates or whatever you have. Okay, it's very important to stay in tune with your router provider just in case they found some very critical vulnerabilities or some attack is happening. Okay, do that. Okay, now what kind of attack is applied to user layer, right? So the user level attacks are all about payload delivery. Okay. I'm not going to spell the whole thing. Now, payloads are generally delivered in two ways, right? Physical or through the internet. Okay. Now, I won't talk too much about physical. All you need to know here is just don't put random thumb drives into your computer, into your personal computer, PC. Okay. Just don't do that. Now, the internet payload delivery is a lot more complicated. There are two sections, there's two layers of attack vectors for internet malicious payload delivery. Okay. So the first one is browser layer. Okay. The second one is host layer. Okay. So browser layer attacks, this involves browser cache and cookies. And trust me, this is not the chocolate milk kind. And the host layers involve disk, CPU, memory. Okay? So let's talk about browser layer specifically and how we can prevent ourselves from getting attacked through this way. Okay. So let's talk about browser payload delivery. And like I said, browser payload delivery does not reach your host machine. Okay, it operates solely on the browser level. It does not reach the host. So what this does is that if when you're watching porn on a very dodgy website or you clicked on a very dodgy email link, they can inject a malicious payload into your browser cache / download it as a cookie. Okay. And what this does is that this payload scours the rest of your browser cache and your other cookies for useful informations. Okay. Now this could be anything, but the most common one is what's called a session token. Okay. Now what is a session token? Well, a session token is that if you have noticed before, sometimes after you log into a website, you are no longer asked to log in the second time if you don't close your browser going to the same website. Okay. That is because when you first log in, you are issued a active session. And with that session, you're given a token. Okay, so you can use that token as the same login session. So what this kind of payload does is that it grabs that token and use that token to go on the same website impersonating you. Okay. Now this is why that a lot of serious websites, as you can see, mostly on banks, as a matter of fact, any financial institutions will have a login time limit, meaning they will automatically log you out after a certain period of time. They won't let you stay logged in. Okay, that is a somewhat safe way of handling this. They give you a timed session token to specifically prevent this kind of attack. Nevertheless, not everybody do that. Okay, so what do? How do we prevent it? Right? So the only thing that we can do really is clear your browser cache regularly. Okay? Clear your browser cache regularly, especially before you know you're gonna visit some very dodgy website and you know why you're there. Okay? And especially those websites that promises hot lonely singles in your area. Don't trust them. Okay? And another thing that you can do is always close your browser after use. Okay? Close browser after use. Don't let it stay open. It causes you a lot more trouble than the conveniences that it provides. Okay? So that's the browser level payload. And this is what you can do. Like, there is not really a definitive way to combat it. So for this kind of attack, awareness is the key. You have to be hyper aware of potential danger and build a good habit to combat this. Okay? Okay. We're on to the one last thing that we're going to talk about, the host's payload deliveries. Okay? The live. Okay. Host payload deliveries are generally some kind of like executable that you download on the web, or sometimes they're embedded into source codes or other executables that you think that you're downloading, but they're actually packing something extra, right? Some good examples might be if you're trying to install a old school software that's been discontinued, you might need to download an installer, right? Especially for Windows. And those installers might come with just a little bit extra packing in there. That is one very common example of getting infected. And some other things might be if you're downloading pirated films, pirated games, all those things that doesn't have an official source that comes from the community. It could potentially be from a bad actor in the community that injected some kind of malicious binaries into the thing that you're actually looking for. So this is the most common attack vector that there is, and it really come with any sources imaginable, right? It can have any sources that this comes in with. The combination of those makes it very difficult to defend, okay? And it is especially difficult because sometimes the antivirus that you have cannot tell between the difference of a good piece of software and a bad piece of software, right? Sometimes there are good faith members of the community, especially when you are downloading community softwares. A lot of times the developers are not verified, and you don't really know whether they're trustworthy or not. And a lot of times, some of those softwares are very good quality of life, and you really want them. So it's not like we can avoid this problem altogether. This is the most common, the most prevalent attack vectors on end users of the internet. So this is where I will recommend something that not everybody is going to like. And that something is called a virtual machine. Okay. Some of you might be familiar with this, and some of you will hate me for saying this, and some of you doesn't know what this is. So a virtual machine is kind of like a mini operating system inside your existing host system. And to be clear, I am not saying virtual machine is infallible. Okay, virtual machine very much is not infallible. As a matter of fact, the most recent vulnerability that we've seen is in 2022, where VMware, the virtual machines that they have, had a out of heap write vulnerability that writes into the host memories, right? That someone could potentially exploit to inject malware into your host machine. Not every virtual machine is infallible. Some of them has security flaws, and some of them probably will have security flaws. But it is still your best bet and can always isolate any threat if done correctly. Okay? So personally, I recommend something called VirtualBox. Okay? And this is free and open source, which means they're publicly vetted to be good, and they're free, which is a nice benefit. And most important of all, VirtualBox isolates the CPU and RAM usage, okay, of your machine, of your host machine. So that means it does not interact with the host whatsoever while it's operating, okay? in any capacity, it does not interact with the host, which makes it operationally safe. Okay. And additionally, you can configure the networks, especially if you use a NAT adapter. You can configure this network adapter to the point where the virtual machine is isolated. Imagine these are your local hosts, and this is your modem. And you can configure it in a way where, and this is your virtual machine, and this virtual machine is completely isolated from the host and the rest of the local host. Okay, so they have nothing to do with the rest of the machines. If you configure your network properly, you can make it so that it does not interact with any other local host. So obviously, I am not suggesting the usage of virtual machine to replace your host machine. That's a very dumb idea. But use a virtual machine correctly as a screening tool can boost your security to a almost impenetrable level. Okay, I'm not going to go into the detail of how to use VirtualBox and how to use a virtual machine. There's plenty of great tutorials out there that you can look up, and there's plenty of guides on how to set up the network settings and set up other settings that this could work. Oh, one thing about virtual machines: never use shared file system. Okay, never ever use shared file system. Always separate them. Always isolate the virtual machine. That's it. That's pretty much everything you need to know about hacking and how to prevent yourself from getting hacked. If I missed anything, if you guys have any questions, feel free to comment. And if you like this video, drop a like or something like that. I don't really give a fuck. I don't make video for a living. But at the end of the day, this video is about raising awareness. I hope after watching this, you are more aware than ever of how hacks can happen on the end customer and user level, and prepare yourself and defend yourself to the best of your abilities. Okay, a aware person is almost unhackable, right? If someone really wants to come after you and they put resources into it, like, it sucks to be you, right? But like, if you're just a random average Joe, or if you're just going on about your life, you don't have a really serious enemy, practicing those will practically make you unhackable. Okay?